Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to continue the discussion about the history of television and how it got started. In a previous episode, we discussed the birth of television going through the golden age of the 1950s. But after the 1950s, things got a little bit weird and interesting. And television really became a key component of the way that we think about things, which makes it fun for people like me who like to study how media affects people and how things can continue to go forward and to our current cell phone usage and how those things affect us. So I'm kind of curious on television because it's the precursor to all this. So let's dig in and have some fun. So as you might recall, when we finished off in the 1950s, we were talking about the kind of excitement from the I Love Lucy show moving from radio to television and how it created syndication and reruns because of all the basically the demands that Lucille Ball had on the industry, and also how the idea of creating sets and shooting, on location changed television as well. So we went away from the stage model to the set model, and that started moving the way people thought about television and the way people viewed things. So in the big turning point, though, is we move into 1960, and that is when people like me who love studying communication and media went, whoa, because what happened in 1960 was the debate between Nixon and Kennedy for the presidential race. This is the first time a presidential debate gets aired on television. So that's a big deal. Cool. But it's more interesting than that because, well, people who watched the debate saw a young and vibrant JFK versus a tired and sickly looking Nixon. Well, what happened was it was in the evening. Nixon had put in a full day. He was fighting a cold. He shows up to the set. He's wearing his suit, but he's got 5 o'clock shadow as men get as the day goes on, fighting a cold, and you look like when you have a cold. And so he gets in front of the set, and turns out the curtains in the background about the same color as his suit. Well, back then, low resolution television, black and white. So he kind of fades away, except for like this floating head, which is 5 o'clock shadow and sickly. Whereas Kennedy was a little bit more savvy, and he got a shower before the debate. He was well rested. He wore a suit that contrasted the curtains. And as a result, he looked youthful, he looked energized, and he looked there. And Nixon just didn't. So the interesting part, though, was how people reacted to it, though. People who listened to it on the radio said Nixon won that debate. People who watched on television said Kennedy won that debate. And then instantly people who study media went, wait, what? How does one medium say one thing and one medium say the other? And that's when people started realizing the power of television. So people who like to study effects of media instantly sat up and took notice. Like, wait a minute. Television has that much of an impact that just by seeing a person, it changes our impression of them and how we view like the words that even come out of their mouths. That's a big deal. That shakes the communication scholarship world. And you can see that being a big deal. Now, we've kind of played with that a little bit before, because when you think about the idea of moving, in creation of film, when you go from the silent film to the talking film, like all of a sudden we can hear your voice and say, oh gosh, you don't have the right voice for this. Your voice is actually weird and we don't like it. Or when you go from radio to television, we have the issue of, oh, we heard you and we thought you looked a certain way. Now we don't like the way you look. Or the adage that we in radio sometimes say is that you have a face for radio. So that's one of those things that comes into play that now so we start realizing that, man, there's something to that. And frankly, if you start looking at like pictures of our past presidents, it's almost like we demand them to have some level of being handsome. The idea of, quote, looking presidential becomes a real thing, as opposed to just being presidential. Looking presidential matters too. Like, when was the last time that we had like truly a fat president or a president with a beard? Look at your pictures of your presidents and see how far back you have to go before you get beards. And you'll see like the coinciding of photography with the disappearance of the beard. So you should be clean shaven to be a president. You should be at least relatively thin. You don't have to be like obviously slender, but you should at least look presidential. Clear to the point of today, we have the idea, several years ago, I think it was in 2015, 2016, in the presidential race then, when the Republican field was, very diverse, and you had Governor Chris Christie running, and one of the first media articles out was asking whether he was too fat to run for president, which is a really shocking thing to ask, but it's also very real when you go back to 1960 and realize how much people pay attention to looks. So the idea that you look too fat to be president, we think that's a harsh thing to ask, but think about how much we're drawn to looks. So 1960 was that thing that really slapped people in the face about how people think about that kind of work. So moving forward, though, with the technology, there's changes going on there too. So in 1962, Congress requires all televisions to have VHF and UHF, frequencies. So the national networks ran on VHF, the independents ran on UHF. VHF is for very high frequency and UHF is for ultra high frequency. So again, the idea that there's a spectrum of frequencies, and everything on that band, there are only so many channels. So the idea we can have so many channels here, we can have so many channels here on these different frequency levels, and therefore we can have so many stations, because we can only have so many. There's only so much room, and so we'll figure out which ones they can go on. Now, other things that happen, 1963, America gets to witness the assassination and funeral of a president. Again, that's one of those things that would be covered by the news, and newspapers, maybe even by the radio or whatever, but to actually have it happen on, not that it was, the broadcast, but we had the Zapruder film that could then be showed later. But, people would tune into the television to see a stern-faced reporter say about how Kennedy was shot, how then Kennedy had died. And then Jack Ruby, of course, being, on the news for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald and killing him. And we get to see this stuff unfold with television. And instead of just reading about it, we actually get to see it. And that changes things. And of course, when you bring in the idea of the war in Vietnam coming in too, think how much that changes things, because it becomes the first televised war. Because it's one thing to have footage that comes from Europe for World War II or from Korea, in the early 50s, but now we actually see televised things of actual war being fought, coming in nightly to our television, and that kind of shapes the mind of people to what they actually think of war. So instead of having this noble image of war and the grandeur of war, we actually see it, and it's gritty and it's awful and it's violent and it's horrific. So you start to see that kind of thing, and people start to kind of sour on the whole idea of war in general. So you see lots of protests, of course, obviously, with the Vietnam War. Also, another thing too, 1967, Congress passes the Public Broadcasting Act. So we create PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. So when you think of things like your Big Bird and all the other fun stuff that you see on PBS, or used to see on PBS before those rights got sold away, you think of that. It goes back to 1967. So that's when we start seeing PBS come into play. And then, of course, 1969, audiences get to witness Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. What an amazing thing to get to see, in the pleasure, the comfort of your own home. You get to have the pleasure of seeing us going to the moon. What a neat thing to see, which, of course, was, reenacted with the Artemis II space mission to the moon and back, and we got to the point now where just like space travel is just part of television. In fact, we've got so many movies about space travel, we don't even think that's even that special, when in actuality, from the physics standpoint, it's really special to be able to fly into outer space. But we're so accustomed to it because of what we've seen. But in 1969, it was a huge deal to be able to tune in, and like the world stopped to watch the landing on the moon, and it was a big deal. Another thing that happened really heavily in the 60s is the idea of how much protection that is granted to what happens on television. And again, in 1961, so going back again to the beginning of this decade, we see the FCC looking at and trying to understand television and trying to figure out, well, what's it good for? And remember, in the 50s, we had just like game shows and comedy and things like that. And because of the expansion of genres, people who viewed it as an important medium started to sour on it. So much so that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the chair, his name was Minow, he called television in 1961 a vast wasteland. And maybe you've thought that sometimes too, and you're just flipping through all the channels and like, there's nothing on. And you just went through 150 channels and said there's nothing on. Well, that's what they were thinking back in 1961. It's like, this could be something good. And remember, the very first broadcast of something on television for the public was a newscast. So now that's important. But I Love Lucy, game shows, really all that, like, what a waste. What a waste of a medium. And so this idea, like, this could be something important and we're using it for all this junk, and it's a vast wasteland. And so you can see people saying that kind of thing, and you can understand why they would do that. So again, it's one of those things that there's been wrestling with television. Now, of course, television enjoys First Amendment protection, and that's not any kind of an issue, but it's just one of those things, like, when people tend to pay attention to what's on TV, they tend to like have that negative thought about what it is. Now, what does it take to get shows on television? Well, this varies, but here's some basic ideas, some things to think about. Roughly, for getting programs on TV, there are basically around 4,000 proposals every year. 4,000. I mean, that's staggering to think about all these ideas. Like, hey, I've got an idea for a TV show. What about if this happened and you have this character and that? Well, so you create a proposal. That's typically your first start of the video production process. You create a proposal. It'll look like this, and it'll have this. It'll have these things and these elements and this style, this tone, this theme, these plot elements, and this is what it will do. Well, of those 4,000, only about 100 are turned into pilots. So they'll give it like a one-episode shot. Like, we will create one episode and see what the people think, and they'll put it out there. So that's a crazy, odds against you moment. So going from 4,000 proposals to only 100 pilots. So there's not many chances there. And it gets worse, because of those 100 pilots, only 25% become a regular TV show. So 75% of pilots fail. They show it one time and you're like, no, and out the window it goes. So, and then of those 25% that survive, only half will last half a season. Ugh. So you'll see them, after 2 or 3 episodes go, no, and kill it, before it goes the whole season. Only a few ever get to be really successful. So when you think of like iconic television shows, you're not naming thousands of them. You're only naming a handful of them. Like, oh yeah, Friends and Seinfeld and the Law and Order show and things like that, and some other spin-offs like that. And you're just naming them, and you're thinking through a few of them. I'm not saying you can't name tons of them over the course of television history, but every year, most of them just disappear without you even knowing it. And if you've ever wondered, like, hey, I like that show, what happened? Well, you are one of the only people that liked that show. That's why it went away, because not enough people did, and it killed it real quick. So it's one of those things where, again, you start 4,000 proposals every year, and it quickly drops down to very few that ever really kind of make it. So typically what happens is, the networks, they're looking for kind of safe ideas. They're looking for safe money from reliable producers. So, whenever you hear about a producer who does really well, like right now, like there's a lot of stuff from Taylor Sheridan that whenever he makes it turns into gold, but he's reliable. He's producing good stuff. And you remember of other people throughout history, like Stephen J. Cannell and others like that, who've always like reliably produced good TV shows, and several of them at once. Again, that's easy money. So they find one who's really good at making easy, safe money, and they stick with that producer because, again, it's safe. Which is why we had a huge glut of reality TV shows for quite a long time, because it's easy, safe money. It doesn't take a lot of money to shoot a reality TV show. You don't have a bunch of elaborate sets and things like that. You just set up a bunch of cameras, let people do people things, and shoot it, and then edit it and add an extra flair, and you're done. It's fairly safe. It's not even heavily scripted either. So, but anyway, the way it works is, so we're looking for that safe money. So producer has an idea. Then producer shops that idea to networks. So they'll approach all the different networks, and now we have all the different streaming services too. So they'll shop it to all these different places and say, who wants to buy it? Buy this idea. So the network then buys what's known as an option, which is the idea of, I like this, I'll take it. We want the rights to it, and so they get a chance to look at it. And then they ask for some kind of an outline, and then they order some kind of script. So the network then says, we'll take this, we want to see a script. So then the producer works with the screenwriter, and they write up a script for a pilot episode. and then the network then takes it and then shoots the pilot. So they'll order the pilot, shoot the pilot, and then have that all ready to go, and then they'll play it, and people will then they'll pay attention to the ratings. Did a lot of people watch it? And not just did a lot of people watch it, did the right people watch it? So they'll look at what they call key demographics, where they're looking for the people who are in a specific zone. Like, especially if you look at like a 16 to 25 year olds, those are the people who got disposable money that they can just go and blow on things. And so they're looking for those people because advertisers will sell to them. People are like 60 and older, and you might have a lot of people like that watching it, but they don't go out and buy a lot of disposable stuff. So it's harder to advertise to them. So that's why they talk about key demographics. They're talking about younger people, because younger people will just blow money, so that's who they want for key advertising. So they will get this, they'll get the outline, they'll get the script, they'll produce the pilot, they'll air it. If the pilot does well and they're satisfied with the numbers that come in from that pilot, then they might order what they call a short order of episodes, like 2. So they might order 2. It's like, okay, we've got good numbers, let's have a couple episodes, and they'll air those 2 episodes, and they'll monitor, does this have good legs? Are people tuning into these episodes? Because they watch the pilot, was that just a flash in the pan? So then watch a couple episodes and then say, yeah, it's still doing well. So then they might run a short order, a series of episodes, maybe 6. Now, TV is also morphing right now. We're almost adopting a British model to where you see a whole series in, being 6 to 8 episodes in a season. It used to be you'd have 22. If you think about some of the TV shows from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, you'll have 20 episodes, 22 episodes in a whole season, and they'll shoot that per year. And now they've cut way back to sometimes as low as 6. So you'll see that depending on how it works. But they'll order a short series, and then if that's successful, they'll order the full season. And if that's successful, then they'll have a reload for the next season 2. So, and sometimes you'll see situations where they'll shoot 2 seasons back to back. That way, at least they're covered and they have it done. Where this especially comes into play is if you have something that's fairly costly to make, and you have to have all the sets, or you're on location, so you shoot it all in one shot while you're there, or it's a situation where you've got young actors and then you have to make sure you shoot them often before they grow up and get old and screw up the filming, because all of a sudden they're now a foot taller and they're getting facial hair. So that's one of those things you tend to see. Now, typically though, a network reserves the right to end a show at any time. So you'll see it sometimes they'll just end it, and sometimes they'll end on a high note, sometimes they'll end on a low note, and depending on there are tons of reasons why they could end it. It could just be that people aren't watching it, so they kill it. It could be that it's too expensive to make. There was a TV show called Seventh Heaven that died while it was still making good money, but it died because, frankly, every character in the series, they kept adding new characters, and people kept in the episode. So as a result, you have this bulging cast, and everyone's getting pay raises every year. So now you have this huge expense of people. Whereas you take like a show like, say, like Walking Dead, where they keep killing people every episode. So you might get a new person that adds in every once in a while, but they keep killing everyone else. So there's no one who's like sticking around and like causing more and more money. They just kill people off. That's a safe, cheap way to keep it going. Just kill off main characters. But if you have several main characters and you keep going year to year to year to year to year, you have a lot of expense. And sometimes you just also run out of creativity. Like, what are we going to do with this? And eventually runs out. And like, again, with Walking Dead, I mean, like the idea plays out. Like, you can only do so much with it. Another problem happened, like, say, with like the TV show MASH. Well, the TV show MASH went on for 11 seasons. It was a great success. Well, there's one problem. The Korean War was only 3 years, and the TV show went on for 11. At some point, it's like, okay, we've played out pretty much every scenario we could talk about. We're way past what the normal war lasted. We're probably a good point to end this one, and so you end up doing that. So you see that kind of thing happen all the time, and it's a big deal. Now, when it comes to the way business is now, again, things are really in the air right now, because you have large corporations buying other large corporations. You had streaming services getting bigger than actual, Hollywood firms, and so it's all in flux right now, and it's hard to say how things are going to work. So a lot of times they're not running your typical models that we're used to seeing. They're trying to figure out how can we maybe produce movies that can then be pushed onto our streaming service, or how we have TV shows that we can push to movies, or maybe releasing TV shows in theaters, and and having TV shows and movies that release at theaters and the TV show at the same time. So you see all kinds of weird goof things going on, and no one has their finger on the pulse because no one exactly knows where it's going to go. So that's a weird thing. It's not like the times of yesteryear where you had television over here, movies over here, and they didn't really mix, and they just did their own thing. But now with this convergence, it's all blended, and it's all weird, and it's all just basic content factory. It's just a question of how they're producing it. Do we make a 2-hour movie, or do we make 8 1-hour episodes and just have it mix? So you can see where it gets really weird. So who knows what's going to happen next with the industry? It's just going to be something we just hang out and watch and see it unfolds. But it's kind of neat to follow it anyway, because again, it's one of those things that's it's important. Television is still an important medium. We still have televisions in our house. We might use them differently. The programming might come to it differently, but it's still an important medium. So because we're still very much attracted by the visual, as we talked about from the very beginning of this episode with the 1960 presidential debate. So it's one of those things that's kind of fun to watch, and it's going to be neat to see how it goes. But for people who study this stuff, it's kind of cool. It's kind of exciting. And to see how we're affected by it is still out there, and it's still something that's it's fun to see and try to understand. But that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate that. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thanks for tuning in anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.